My name is Tyler Dixon. I'm a graduate student at McDaniel College. Today is March 28th, 2011, and I'm speaking with Dr. Marilyn Smith, a chemistry professor here at McDaniel. So thank you for taking your time to do this. And I just wanted to start with a couple introductory questions. So if you could start, where and when were you born?
I was born in Evanston, Illinois, which is north of Chicago, in 1951.
Okay. So where did you go to school? Did you go to school up there, elementary through high school?
Yeah, I lived in Illinois until I went off to college. So I went to elementary and then Nutra East High School, which is in Winnetka, Illinois. And then when I went off to college, I went to St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota, and then graduate school at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Excellent. Okay, so if you could tell us, what brought you to Carroll County then?
Well, actually, I came to Fredrick County first, and I still live in Fredrick County, not Carroll County. But after I got my PhD degree, I got a job at Fort Detrick in the Cancer Research Division at Fort Detrick.
Okay. So when and how did you get interested in science, or more specifically chemistry? Was that sort of a lifelong passion, or?
Sophomore year in high school, my chemistry teacher, whose name was Mr. Applebaum, got me hooked on chemistry. He was fantastic, and I thought chemistry was really interesting. So when I went to college, I was actually a dual math and chemistry major in college. And then I got interested in biochemistry when I took that course in college and did the lab that was associated with it, which is my field, biochemistry.
Excellent. Okay, could you tell us a little bit how you came to work in McDaniel?
Sure. After I had worked at the cancer division for, about 15 years or so, I started realizing that a lot of what I was doing and teaching some of the summer students that came through the building and through our department, I would very much like to teach to students on a regular basis. So I started looking around to see if maybe I could do some teaching on a part-time basis, since I'd never really done that before, and got the job at McDaniel here, which was in the first year just teaching some general chemistry labs, and then the next year then I worked into teaching general chemistry and then biochemistry, and I also teach some additional non-majors courses, a forensic chemistry course for forensic science minors, and a woman in science course.
Excellent. So about how many years ago, how long have you been at McDaniel now?
This is my 13th year.
13th year. Okay, great. So could you tell us, how has it changed over the years? The student body, instructors, staff. What have you seen?
I guess one of the biggest things I've noticed is that when I first came, and then talking to other professors who have been here even longer in our department, that years ago, two things I guess that have changed. Years ago, there were a lot more men in general chemistry than women in the courses. So we've seen a really, I guess, rapid, and if you count 10, 15-year time period, of having those courses be primarily men, and that was certainly true when I was in college, to primarily women now. So that's flipped around quite a bit. The other change, I guess, is that many years ago there were very few minorities on our campus at all, and that's changed enough that we're certainly seeing minorities in our classes now, which is fantastic.
So you'd say that there are definitely more women and minorities taking science classes at McDaniel?
Yes.
What about instructors? Have you noticed any difference in the instructors here at the school? Have they become more diverse in the science department, less diverse, or?
It's years ago, again, there were no women in the science department.
Yeah.
At least in chemistry and biology, there have always been some women instructors. And probably the first woman was in the, I'd say early 1980s. And before that, it had been all men. And now there are 2 women, so making out of 5 major instructors. So that's certainly making some progress from, say, 20, 30 years ago.
That's great. Okay, so you've been here for 13 years now.
Right.
Could you tell us a little about the research you've been doing at McDaniel? I know we talked about you did some genealogy research.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little about that?
Sure. I actually have a chemistry research project and then an added interest, which is this genealogy research project. And my chemistry research project is using what's called computer-aided drug design, i.e. you use a computer before you actually go in the lab and make compounds. And what I'm trying to design are drugs to combat AIDS. And so that's my chemistry-related project. In addition to that, from doing my own family genealogy, I got interested in the genealogy of some of the early graduates of the college, including the first two African-American graduates, which was in 1969. And so I've been looking at the genealogy of Victor Mateer and Joseph Smothers, who were these first two individuals, and I've done more on Joe Smothers and have traced a lot of his roots back to slave ancestors in Fredrick County in Maryland.
Oh, okay. Well, that sounds fascinating. Anything else about your research of particular interest that you wanted to share about your genealogy? Did you find anything else interesting through your...
Only that doing genealogy research can be incredibly frustrating at times.
Yeah.
Just because, for instance, one of Joe's ancestors was named Mary Smothers. Well, a common name, and it's very hard to trace the origin of that name if he was indeed derived from slave roots, who was the owner, and I found multiple Mary Smothers in the state of Maryland, and so tracing the exact lineage has been a bit difficult.
So have you shared your results with, have you been in contact
Yes.
with?
Yes.
Okay, so that they're well aware of
Yes,
what you've been doing?
and for instance, yes, I typed up a preliminary document on what I had found so far, sent it to Joe, and he shared it with his terminally ill mother.
Oh, wow.
And she got a lot of new information that she hadn't had before she passed
That's
away.
wonderful.
So he seemed very grateful that I had dug back further than he knew about and found some connections and interesting facts that they did not know about before. So I'm kind of at a roadblock now, but this summer I'm hoping to be able to get back a little bit further on that.
So he was happy with everything?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Excellent.
And at some point I'm hoping to be able to give a talk here, and I have his permission to do so. I just want to get a little bit more nailed down before I actually share that with the college community.
Okay. So I wanted to talk a little about the courses that you teach here at McDaniel, and more specifically, have you noticed any changes in the science classes? You sort of said that more minorities and women are taking classes at McDaniel, especially in the sciences. But do you feel that is changing as a whole in the science field?
I think that, well, again, comparing to just ballpark 50 years ago, something like that, at that point there was still a lot of, maybe disrespect isn't quite the right word, but non-acceptance of women in the science fields in general. It was a little easier for biology students as women than it was for chemistry or physics, the quote hard sciences.
Yeah.
Lack of acceptance for multiple reasons, somewhat perhaps misidea that women weren't as intelligent, didn't have the mathematical capability that men had in order to be able to do the harder sciences. Kind of the old boys club network that men would go at the bigger universities to a lunchroom, for instance, and they would meet and talk science, and women were just excluded from that because it was just the old boys club.
Yeah.
These were the people that did the better science. If a couple were married and both were trying to do science, it was generally always perceived that the man was the brains and the woman was perhaps the hands to do the particular job, but her husband was the one that would generate all of the ideas behind their research projects, for instance. So I think that has certainly changed. A lot of research into intelligence and from other fields has shown that old perception that men are brighter in mathematical ability, for instance, than women has now been put to rest. So I think there's a lot more general acceptance of women. You see it in companies, in chemical companies. There are a lot more executives. They've broken the glass ceiling, if you will. It's probably better here than in some places in Europe, for instance, where not everything has changed for the best yet, but things are progressing.
Well, let me ask you, have you ever, you've been doing science for quite a long time now in research. Have you ever encountered any problems being a woman in the science field? Have you ever, come up to someone that, maybe didn't think you could do, didn't think you were up to the task of doing something, or, any sort of prejudices that you've seen?
Only a little bit in graduate school. My entering class in graduate school was composed of 35 students. There were 3 women and 32 men. And some of the professors, I didn't feel treated me fairly. They seemed to think that I would not do as good a job. Maybe I shouldn't get as hard of a project to tackle. So I always felt like I had to prove myself at that point, but that was back in the 1970s, and I think things have certainly changed a lot since that time. I would imagine that entering classes of graduate schools are not so slanted towards men anymore.
Yeah.
But it wasn't overt, but there was always, from some professors, a bit of an undercurrent that they didn't regard me as serious of a student as some of the men, perhaps, in graduate school.
So while at Fort Detrick, you've never really ran into any...
I personally have not, but I saw other cases of other women who were not treated fairly.
Could you talk about that a little bit, or?
There was some sexual harassment at Fort Detrick among some of the men who thought that they were superior and they were not treating the women in their lab well.
Yeah.
The other disparity is certainly in pay, that women have lagged behind men doing the same type of job, and the men were paid more. And this is not just science. This is, of course, if you listen to the current statistics, in lots of other fields too, but it was certainly true there also that women just weren't paid at the same level, or perhaps advanced up the ladder quite as quickly as men were.
We were talking about women. What about minorities? Have you seen any instances where minorities weren't treated in a beneficial
Quite
fashion?
honestly, there were no minorities at Fort Detrick when in the sciences. When I worked at Fort Detrick, we had 1 or 2 summer students in the last few years that I was there, and I left there in 1997. So there were a few summer students at that point, but no permanent employees that I had any interaction with, at least, were minorities. So I can't really judge that real well, and I don't know of any instances of that through the grapevine, so to speak.
Do you think that was just indicative of not many minorities being in science, or?
Yeah, I think that that's certainly true. I don't think that it was Fort Detrick that was
purposely.
Purposely not hiring minorities. There just were very few. And perhaps they didn't want to work on an Army base or didn't want to work in that particular field doing cancer research. I obviously don't know the answer to that, but that's just kind of the way it was at the time that I was there, at least. I imagine that has changed, at least hopefully, for the better.
Yes. Yeah. So you said that you teach a course, Women in Science, here at McDaniel. Could you just give us a little background about that course and just kind of what you do in there? And
Sure. My idea was to bring some of these ideas to the forefront that we have discussed already. What opportunities exist for minorities in science? What obstacles have women had to contend with and overcome in order to be successful? So in order to do this, the way I designed the course was to go all the way back to the beginning with Aristotle and include men's accomplishments as a kind of setting, if you will, to be able to then discuss where the contributions that women have made to various fields.
yeah,
But because there were so few women scientists way back when, you have to set the history of science by including men's accomplishments and then talk about how women have added to that. So we start way back with Aristotle, go up through the Renaissance. I discuss women in various fields, so we consider astronomy, mathematics, chemistry, biology, physics, all kinds of different disciplines in the sciences. And I include in this, first of all, original readings. So if a woman scientist, for instance, published a paper back in the 1800s that was actually in a journal where we could get access to it, I've gotten that original writing and I give it to the students to be able to read so they can see, first of all, how science was written and how that's changed from back many, many years ago to the current, and also to see some of the interesting ways that the women had to submit their articles with the support of a brother or a husband or someone that would shepherd that paper through the peer review process in order to get it accepted for them to be taken seriously. So we go from Aristotle up through the Middle Ages, then up to the Renaissance, and then gradually work our way up to current, and we end with looking at Nobel Prize women in science, then how many have there been, what have their contributions been, what fields have women won Nobel Prizes in, how does this compare to the Nobel Prizes that have been awarded to males in science. So there's quite a disparity, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
And in the last 20 years or so, what strides have been made? And there have been a lot in the last 20, 30 years, a lot more women winning Nobel Prizes.
Yeah.
So again, a fair amount of progress. And we look at the obstacles that they face. Some women had to dress as men in order to be accepted.
Yeah.
They had to sneak into lectures. They weren't allowed labs on the first, second, third floor. They were relegated to the basement in labs sometimes. They had to go down the street to use restroom facilities in a restaurant because there were only bathrooms for the male scientists in the particular buildings and no accommodation for any kind of female who wanted to do any scientific work. So a lot of various obstacles. So we talk through all those obstacles. We look at the research on are men more intelligent than women in various aspects. And so we kind of put those old hypotheses to rest that there were innate brain differences between men and women. And so then we kind of end with what's the current situation. We look at various countries to see is it better in one country than another. What obstacles remain is how we kind of end the course then.
Okay. What sort of response do you get from the students, and what is the makeup of the class? Is it?
This is a class for non-majors, so I get one or two science major students who are just kind of interested in the history of science and want to learn more about it. But this is a class for non-majors, so they get a little bit of philosophy, a bit of history, and then science on a non-majors level. So we actually talk about, for instance, Marie Curie, what science did she actually carry out? So explain a little bit about nuclear chemistry, for instance, and the concept of radioactivity. And so the students then actually get some science in there, and then we do a few little mini labs, if you will, so they get a little hands-on experience in a short kind of format of doing things like isolating DNA, for instance, or gazing at the stars, and so trying to recreate at least a little bit some of the experiments that some of the women scientists did.
What about do more females take the course, more
yeah,
males?
it is primarily composed of women. We do, every time I've taught it, I've had, I guess between one time there was only one gentleman in the course, but he was very vocal, so that was great. He spoke up. And I've had up to 5 or 6 out of 24. So, I mean, that makes for a much better blend, obviously, to get a lot of the male opinions on issues, too.
Do you get many minorities taking it, too? Or
I have had a few, probably, again, out of 24 students, and it's been pretty full each time I've taught it with a cap of about 24, so we've got few enough people we can do these little labs. There have been 3-4 minorities, so that's, about average in terms of the, given the enrollment at the college, that's about a proportionate number.
So let me ask you, so after you teach this course, what are some of your suggestions that you think, or do you feel that you talked about, the pay discrepancy between men and women, and do you have any solutions or thoughts about how more women could get involved in sciences or minorities in sciences?
I think that the pay disparity has to be settled, because that may be keeping some young women from being interested in science. I think that where we need to hook the women is not at the college level, but earlier. Women have to be encouraged, young girls in even late elementary school, middle school. They need to be shown that women are successful in science and feel like they have the capability of doing science. I think what keeps some students in general, and of course this applies to both men and women, is lack of mathematical ability is perceived, or math background, rigorous math background, may certainly deter some students. And I think that if students are told that they can do the math and encouraged early on to try it, that I think that we might be able to get higher enrollments than in high school, and then in AP classes, for instance, in high school, and then having more women want to major in chemistry when they come to college. Yeah. So I think it has to start back at that level. Do we convince some non-majors who might take a chemistry class like my forensic chemistry class, which again is for non-majors really, some forensic science minors who are social majors, for instance. Yeah. And there are certainly women in there that then get convinced that, gee, I can do this. I kind of like chemistry in high school, and I think this is pretty neat, and maybe I want to switch my major. So I certainly have had a few that have done so. Yeah. So, but I think in general we have to cure the problem by starting a little bit earlier with these students. Way back when there was a Barbie doll that had this phrase that, oh, math is so hard. Yeah. And those type of perceptions have to be put to rest. Yeah. Young women have to feel like they have the capability to do this if this is what they want to do, and that science can be really interesting and a really fulfilling career.
Do you feel like we will ever get to that point?
I think we're slowly getting there, but it's not something that's going to happen in the next 5 years, 10 years, but the numbers show that we are slowly making some progress.
So let me ask, so a lot of, studies have shown that a lot of women or minorities lag in science classes. Do you feel like there are any reason for those lags? Do you feel it's the teachers that you talked about, maybe starting them a bit earlier, or the teachers getting more involved in telling them that they can do it. Do you think that's a potential solution for the, you see all these studies where minorities and women are lagging behind white males. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on.
I think it's not really, or it shouldn't be targeted to just women or minorities. I think that in general, the lack of math preparation through early schooling years is a universal problem that I see in introductory chemistry courses. And so I think that this is more the problem than, and maybe there's again this disproportionate number of women and minorities based on their, where they went to high school or their, which, no fault of their own, obviously. The level of the math courses at their school have just made them feel like I can't handle the math when they get to high school chemistry, for instance, and then much less college chemistry, which ramp it up one more level. And so I think it's not really women and minorities. I think it's a more universal problem of lack of math preparation in general is frustrating then, and so they think, oh, I can't do science because I can't do math, so I'm going to pick another major.
Okay, well, excellent. Well, I think that's, I don't have any other questions, so I guess we can wrap this up. So I wanted to thank you for sharing your time.
My pleasure.
Is there anything you wanted to share about science or any interesting stories or anything? Or
all I have to say is that it's a fantastic field. There's constantly new things being discovered, interesting problems to solve, and if you have any kind of aspirations to open your mind and study nature, go for science.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for your time.
You're quite welcome. My pleasure.